Hello again, friends. This is Rob Womack. I'm the author of this little book, Jubilee, the Emancipation of Life and Love, and I'm here today to read you another chapter from the book. The fifth chapter begins with an epigraph written by James Madison from the Federalist Papers, number 10. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Chapter 5. Overseers of a Pyramid. Midnight is nearly upon us. The toll of the bells is only a few minutes away. Yet at 256 revolutions per minute, there is still a fair distance to travel. Several hundred orbits will elapse prior to arrival. No need to tarry, nor to rush. Patiently, persistently, onward we press. With time and space framed so minutely, distinguishing transitions blurs. In such small fractions, beginnings and endings become more difficult to discern. Though the instability of change occurs incessantly, a perceived sense of powerlessness pervades. In spite of the frequency of decisions, immutable continuity seems to overpower. Contrary to outward appearances, opportunities for new trajectories emerge moment by moment and day by day. Before the universal ethic of care was co-opted, the instructions embedded in the tiny mustard seed conveyed an unspoken, unwritten message to all beings upon the web of life and love. Everything had been freely given to be equally shared by all. Elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin gave to the best of their ability and took only as they needed. Land and water were commonly shared and from no one withheld. Unconditional exchange was managed by the instructions bequeathed from our greatest great-grandparent. Continuity in the midst of change regulated creative divergence, cooperative convergence, and contented equality. Homeostasis was perpetually maintained. As Euro-American self-serving interpretations of their scriptures devolved, another of Sapiens' offspring, later known as Homo economicus, wished to add a few interpretations of their own. They surveyed the hierarchy as erected. It was indeed beautiful to behold, quite slender, very tall. Although to eyes more critical, its stability teetered precariously. If ever it were to tip and fall, those on the upper rungs risked significant injury. Economicus desired a more imposing shape. The society they envisioned was wide at the bottom and tapered as it rose. It would defy the universal law of gravity with a dynamism that drew wealth and power from bottom to top. An organization such as this would be difficult to topple, while immense prosperity was suctioned up. A solid foundation was stacked like bricks of all neighbors unlike Sapiens. Layered upon that very broad base was the vast majority of humans, grouped and divided as women, children, seniors, foreigners, and neighbors with disabilities or darker hues of skin. A plurality of Euro-Americans composed the middle layer. They were the pedestal upon whom the aforementioned minority reposed. From this middling position, they could also serve as tireless monitors of the underlings who slaved, then withered, below. To execute such a plan, Economicus knew, would be quite a challenge. Odds were decidedly against. For so few to take from so many, the scheme must be extraordinarily diabolical. Success would require widespread complicity. The Euro-American male's contrived superiority must seem admirable when compared to the misery of everyone else. Only in such an environment would so many strive to be like them, those exclusively permitted, of course. The more miserable the beings beneath, the more convincing the comparisons, and the more motivated the response. Resistance would be lowered, compliance increased, outcomes achieved, voila. Mechanisms must also enable the material wealth of innumerable humans through a lifetime of effort and generation after generation to be gradually siphoned off. A much smaller number would reap their loss. The sluice in between, the moderate middle, would contentedly hold the line. To achieve a tie as the impoverished fail would feel like victory, a sure sign that the system worked efficiently. A handful, of course, would need to ascend to join the small group above, a narrow path of upward mobility to stoke the meager hopes of those less fortunate. A smattering would climb the steps to replace the losses due to erosion and attrition. Addiction's costs were kept well hidden. Externalities became the preferred euphemism. Economicus wished for a market where trade was anything but free. What they designed was a vast, adaptable pyramid scheme. No one recalls who first conceived of such a dastardly plot. Based on outcomes, the name was likely naive. In point of fact, some evidence is indisputable. Whoever the culprit, they began with a belief previously unthinkable. More of the material and energy freely given to be equally shared was theirs to keep. They deserved it. Others did not. Whoever conceives such a belief, like Adam before them, has evaded responsibility. The name may be lost to ignominy, but to this very day the habit persists. To be implemented, they must have had the help of a few close friends. Nothing meaningful can be accomplished alone. Change evolves in predictable patterns. Minor divergences precede broad adaptations. If hope, courage, and trust converge, fertile soil ripens for cooperative, interactive beings to emerge. Without them working in tandem, however, the good fruit spoils. Lacking better instincts, the secret club sought to satisfy their omnivorous appetites. They began to hoard that which was meant to move. Their bodies developed a gnawing hunger, even when stomachs were full. As a mission statement, they adopted a chant, "Takers, keepers, losers, weepers." Until death, they pledged to keep it sustainable. In this way, no one ever had to stomach the words, stop or no. As the hoarding accumulated, more contented neighbors noticed a change. Inexplicably, fewer tokens of gratitude were circulating. The needs for housing, food, medicine, and protection had not decreased, nor had their ability to provide. And yet, trade had somehow declined. Some neighbors, lacking tokens but with a moral compass still intact, felt compelled to ask for even less. Others simply did without. Euro-Americans began to conceive of new categories. Among them were the haves and the have-nots. A new separation wedged in. A pernicious asymmetry grew. Scarcity became a word to symbolize the visceral experience of a few. All that was needed to flourish and thrive remained well within sight. Yet now, for some, it was kept slightly out of reach. The hoarding of money had raised the specter of poverty, its inseparable ill-begotten twin, wealth, and the insidiousness of inequality. Out of nowhere, fear emerged. Like water, it seeped into every crevice and every pore. Providers clutched what neighbors needed. Warily, their fists released. Consumers grew restless. Someday might they be denied the means of their survival? Economic fear, mixed with hierarchical divisions, rose like a mounting flood. Together they evoked a new phenomenon, later known as competition. Fear spread slowly but steadily. Due to Economicus's secrecy and shame, the steward managers were caught unawares. Suddenly, a new tool had to be devised, a psychological barricade to stop panicky humans from wildly taking that which remained within sight but was kept away from grasping hands. The barricade could not be static, however. Materials could not be locked away forever. The dynamism of commerce, if sustained, must be well regulated. If providers allowed a mechanism to release their goods and service, the withholding of their neighbors' needs could be physically enforced. Thus, in the name of balanced neutrality, Economicus and their market were appeased. This was the steward manager's first mistake, but far from their last. Of course, implementation may have occurred in the reverse. Instead of anonymous consumers hoarding money and instilling fear, providers may have been the first to opt out of caring for their neighbors. They may have unilaterally determined, regardless of the loss, some humans are simply undeserving, indeed less than human, worthless to keep alive. Those so unscrupulous were never memorialized, nor has anyone, as of yet, claimed responsibility. Motivations in this scenario would include fear and its corollary hate, rather than unadulterated greed. If this were the case, the steward managers legalized the withholding, but sought to appease impoverished customers by forcing the providers, against their will, to release the neighbor's needs. In either circumstance, outcomes were unchanged. The unique innovation devised by the steward managers was called ownership, a concept conceived exclusively within the figments of the human imagination. If the money on hand was insufficient to procure a release, owners were permitted to withhold from their neighbors anything they might need to survive. In addition, owners were assigned the power to dictate, like a ransom, the price of release. Any consequences, regardless of how tragic, were considered meaningless. The concept of ownership was implemented slowly. Radical changes must start small. Humans need time to grow accustomed to new ways, after all. The steward managers decreed that if there were options to acquire a lesser substitute, only the better of the two could be owned, withheld, bought, and sold. Euro-Americans had been primed to accept the divisions of better and worse. Some material objects, like their neighbors, were assumed to be more worthy than the rest. As more people began to accept the new idea that some material objects and energetic work could be owned and withheld, valued, ransomed, and released, the concept spread. Everyone wished to be, and to own, what was valuable and superior to everyone else. Owning and withholding thus escalated the cost of release. Eventually, the concept of ownership was applied almost universally. Only sunlight, gravity, and air managed to escape. Everything else under the sun, it seemed, could be owned and withheld. Indeed, the physical work to care for each other and to preserve life was ransomed. Neighbors were forcibly captured, auctioned to the highest bidder, and permanently named as slaves. Others surrendered themselves to be rented temporarily. These acquired another name, employees. Land as well was owned, likewise the water, food, and medicine which emerged from the land, and the wood captured in trees which built and heated the homes. On maps made of paper, borders were inscribed. Titles and deeds were assigned. The documents were traded for vast sums of money, in spite of the fact that they were merely permission slips to occupy spaces freely given and structures built and paid for long ago. Once Euro-Americans realized nearly everything necessary for survival could be withheld, they turned their backs completely on the instructions of the great-grandparent and the universal ethic of care. No longer would they give to the best of their ability, nor consume only for their needs. Going forward, the acquisition of money from a small and apparently shrinking supply, though the numbers continued to multiply, established itself as the one and only motivation. Due to scarcity on one hand and desire on the other, fear mixed with greed, the pace of consumption quickened noticeably, at least, that is, among those with surplus money. On one hand, money seemed a silky lubricant which kept society running. Most decisions were filtered through the questions, how much will it cost, and how much can be made? If answers were either too much or not enough, respectively, money magically morphed. It became the gravel in the gears of commerce. For Euro-Americans to work to care for neighbors without regard for money fell far beyond the realm of comprehension. Numerals, denominated as dollars, a psychological construct with no basis in reality, stopped them dead, sometimes literally. With imagination so calcified, the tragic consequences ramified. Humans were no longer concerned for the care of their elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin. From now on, it was every man for himself. If others had to do without, so be it. That only leaves more for me, was often heard, then believed. Probably they deserved it anyway, lazy savages. To impose the concept of ownership required a heavier hand of government than earlier imagined. Rulers, formerly steward managers, now in need of unjust compensation, procured taxes from the citizens. Additional levies allowed the rulers to dole out privileges to bribe citizen complicity. Under the circumstances, compliance was easily coerced. New specialties in the divisions of labor had to be created, also requiring unjust compensation. Warriors, officers, and regulators were selected to enforce compliance. New instructions called laws told slaves and employees what to do while the pyramid was constructed, and how to behave during periods of rest. At times, the bribes and privileges proved insufficient to gain full compliance. In response, regulators were authorized to seize the assets of non-cooperative owners of wealth and property. Seizures were deposited in the rulers' vaults and redistributed to their minions' burgeoning coffers. For the non-cooperative citizens, who owned neither wealth nor property, with the stroke of a pen, rulers changed their status to criminals. Then the rulers' henchmen, the warriors and officers, could coerce the poor physically. Mild corrections were meted out through harsh treatment. If the warriors or officers lost their composure, out of fear or anger, let's say, no need to fret or worry. With the same pen in hand, rulers justified all killings legally. The terrifying message to witnesses and survivors was clearly received. Physical enforcement was a blunt but effective instrument. Weapons were invented to safely kill humans from beyond arm's reach. Then there were the cages to keep the living locked inside. State-sponsored terror was legitimated through euphemisms like law and order, military rules of war, and police use of force. Private citizens ruthlessly patrolled their right to bear arms. With such imaginative ideas, violence was duly authorized. Euro-American religious leaders, the unlikely co-conspirators of the erectors of the pyramid, used softer methods to coerce behavior. Thoughts and beliefs were regulated through rituals and messaging. They told a story of eternal torture for the disobedient, eternal rewards for the submissive, and innate sin but grace for the supposedly unworthy. Rational humans with little to no power solve the dilemma easily. Better to submit. What's the harm after all? There is no sense in taking chances that you'll burn later on. Close quote. Faithful humans obediently followed along. They avoided sin as the religious leaders had defined it, at least publicly, and welcomed any possibility of grace. The process has been humming along, serving its purpose with a few twists and turns ever since. With notions of property rights and religious thought thoroughly enmeshed, those backed by the privileges of surplus wealth and authority allowed voracious appetites to swell. Henceforth they were willing, or so they said, to never release the material energy and work to meet even the most basic needs, unless and until, that is, a heftier ransom was paid. In the game of chicken, Economicus knew, self-preservation would cave long before greed. The ransoms were wildly successful. Owners dictated prices at the maximum consumers could bear. A new concept, profit, was enshrined. The only restraints Economicus now faced were the neighbors' habits of consumption and the amount of cash on hand. Soon, however, even these would chafe Economicus's limitless greed. As a result of the ubiquitous messaging, Euro-Americans came to firmly believe that unless more was taken than was needed, the insatiable market would be unsustainable. To survive, it must be overfed. The addictions and corruption of inequality had become so pervasive, a simple mathematical contradiction escaped them. Actual sustainability depends on taking not more, but less from what is available. To increase profits and the upward suction of cash, Economicus became adept at utilizing their neighbors' natural propensity to cooperate. Coordinating specialties and talents allowed for the emergence of economies of scale. Complex systems were organized, called corporations, reminiscent of the corporeal beings who comprised them. People who worked together were more productive, which could have led to more play, more rest, and more creativity. Unfortunately, due to the dynamic free market's fierce adaptability and equally persistent greed to colonize every square inch, the principles of the corporation became as corrupted as the rest of society. Someone staked a claim of ownership, and the embodied corporations were cordoned off for sale. The entities were divided into fractional shares and sold for total sums far greater than any individual could afford. Owners of shares called stocks granted themselves sole authority to set the rules, extract as much labor for as little cost as possible while maximizing revenues. All income was collected into silos to increase shareholder value. These silos were later renamed accounts for savings and retirement. While permitted, owners of wealth could purchase humans on the free open market for a handsome one-time price. Rights to private property were entitled for life and defended to the death. Afterwards, Corporations benefited from the employee's right to be rented temporarily. In exchange, owners of the fractional shares reaped rewards from other people's work. Here's a quote. "Put your money to work for you," was the slogan, which translated to, "Make someone else work twice as much while you, the prudent investor, retire." The accumulation of wealth allowed a few humans to withhold their gifts and talents while neighbors burdened with double the responsibilities worked for marginal incomes pegged to a minimum. Economicus preferred the phrase, "as much as they are worth." Economicus began to chafe, however, at the hard and fast limits of consumers' minimal cash. If Economicus was to accumulate even larger sums, consumers would have to spend more than they could earn as employees. Motives to increase employee wages, it goes without saying, were not incentivized. Economicus craved a new device to resolve the seemingly intractable conundrum. Fortunately for hoarders of wealth atop the pyramid, even corrupted imaginations, when rested, function quite well. An idea arose that would arrest the underlings for the remainder of their days. After the untimely demise of Pharaoh's army, slavery fell out of favor, but by other names, it would rise again. If money, like everything else, could be owned, withheld, and released for a profitable ransom, then it could be lent upon condition of its return. Those who lacked money enough for today would pay a fee, like rent, later called interest, for the privilege to borrow temporarily. Better yet, the rents and interest could continue for perpetuity. Money in and of itself was impotent. As an accumulated surplus, it was stagnant and useless. Therefore, the principal could idle anywhere as long as rent, interest, and dividends flowed up and in. If the principal were ever repaid, it would only be reinvested elsewhere. To logical observers, such an idea, to give large sums now and receive small sums slowly over time, seemed irrational and unsustainable. Economicus, on the other hand, was cunning and prescient. Like dealers in a casino, they knew if enough hands were dealt and rents sufficiently spread, outcomes would always turn out in their favor. As long as the dealer held the cards and everyone agreed to play by the rules of the house, the system would work efficiently. Losers paid out to winners. For the sleight of hand, Economicus dealt themselves a lavish cut. In their time off, acting in the role of consumers, employees were issued money through loans to spend easily and quickly today. Next week, when they returned to work, they would work more hours to try to earn the money borrowed and spent, plus interest, as well as their ongoing needs for today. Saving for an uncertain future, it dangled further out of reach than it had the day before yesterday. As anxiety increased, so did employee retention, while their power to bargain declined precipitously. Borrowers were divided by the owner-lenders into two distinct groups. One they loved to see coming, the other they nearly despised. The preferred group were hoarders like themselves. Ample cash was kept on hand, but more was needed to feed insatiable appetites. Due to their preferred status, borrowing from a lender cost less than using their own reserves. Interest rates were relatively cheap. Profits for the lenders were low risk, almost guaranteed. Due to the low cost and easy returns, in a relaxed manner, larger sums were issued for longer periods of time. To sweeten the deal even further, rulers bribed borrowers with a deduction in taxes to accept more from lenders than they might otherwise. In the short term, however, lower returns had to be made up by someone. The group the lenders most despised were saddled with the cost to subsidize the benefits of the well-heeled. Oddly enough, those with the greatest need were charged higher rates than those with the most ability to pay. The least preferred borrowers work for income from owner-employers who pay the absolute least, barely enough to break even, and if possible, less. Wages were pegged, so surpluses were never a possibility. When an unforeseen crisis arose, the employee's minimal pay was insufficient to meet the additional expense. Under the circumstances, they faced an irreconcilable choice: default on the medical bill, utilities, car payment, or rent. Late fees and penalties, pejorative synonyms for interest, only deepened the hole and the shame faced next month. Due to the deficits between income and expenses, owner-lenders were asked to subsidize the owner-employer's meager wages. Begrudgingly, they agreed, but only on one condition: those most in need must pay the highest rates. To mollify the shame of any conscientious lender, higher interest rates were readily justified. Those with the greatest need, and often a darker skin or lacking a manly anatomy, were perceived as the least worthy, least reliable, and therefore the greatest risk. Into the melee, more frugal conservative neighbors were drawn. As participants in a ubiquitous system which functioned as designed, the machinations landed on everyone. In their day-to-day expenses as consumers, non-borrowers were asked to pay more. Prices had to cover the insufficient wages of the borrower-employee's present needs, plus the debts of yesterday. When non-borrowing consumers returned to work, they too felt compelled to demand more. Pressure was applied to the owner-employers who passed the burden along to their customers. An upward spiral set in. The phenomenon of competition, a euphemism for opposition, overtook the Euro-Americans. Nearly everyone became the targets of distrust, resentment, and scorn, those who earned less and those who earned more. Only those who self-identified safely in the middle believed no one resented them, until the inevitable day when the hollowed middle was no more. At the time, Euro-Americans cheered, until finally they believed, "Free market capitalism, it's the best there's ever been." Income-producing assets, savings, and retirement funds generated a reliable updraft. Rents, interest, profits, dividends, and regressive tax deductions filled the conduits to suction up wealth from below. These devices withdrew funds from those left with too little and deposited the losses in the accounts of those who already had too much. They siphoned wealth from the rich to the poor, from losers to winners, from the bottom to the top. With no alternatives available and no imagination for the common good, the colonizers appeared to have won. Those willing to acquire the most and give the least, as well as to create the greatest harms and deceits, had become the most visible, admirable, and successful, according to the definitions of the Euro-Americans. With the disgruntled quietly mollified in their despair, those with above-average income and wealth refined their self-image with polite informalities, a translucent veil to thinly disguise a shared inequality. In the short span of their brief existence, the stories Euro-Americans had heard as children and their experiences as adults all came into alignment. The inescapable reality was one of competition rather than cooperation, individual salvation rather than collective well-being, piety and suffering in this life for a reprieve of paradise after death, and pity for the poor, scorn for the rich, and an irreproachable but shrinking middle class. With the aperture of the heart and mind so constricted, everything seemed to fit perfectly. For the Euro-Americans, the fairy tale rang true, until only seconds ago the story took an unexpected turn. At the commencement of the very last minute of the 99th increment of time, two events converged which might, before all is said and done, toll the death knell. First, the form of religious thought known as Euro-American Christianity lost credibility. As the mask fell away like chaff from a seed, humans looked to understand the universe in new ways. They derived a new method in which to place their faith and to expand their supremacy. The new method began to usurp the explanations of old. Rational, enlightened Euro-Americans discredited any powers greater than their own. Experimental science began to probe the laws of the universe. Rather than to observe the instructions as they played out and to learn from them, scientists adopted a paradigm and worked backwards instead. Conditions were arranged and manipulated until the desired outcomes were achieved. Occasionally, scientists stumbled upon results unforeseen. Subjective explanations were proposed to later test the anomalies. Unlike the leaders of wayward religion, scientists held such explanations with modest skepticism. Diligent attempts were made to prove the explanations false in order to demonstrate the reliability of their initial predictions as well as their unbiased objectivity. By keen observation and rigorous repetition, as the instructions played out again and again, the scientists' abilities to accurately predict and craft sound explanations appeared to improve. Their participatory role in the observations, the perceptions one wishes to see, were discreetly ignored. If objectivity was questioned, hubris pushed back rather than humility. If observations diverged too radically from the norm, like guardians of a bulwark called paradigm, scientists swarmed. Novel discoveries, like prior discoveries of new worlds with no inhabitants, at least none as civilized as those of the Euro-Americans, were staked as a claim of intellectual property. Then, to the highest bidder, they were sold. Euro-Americans began to act as if they actually had been granted dominion. According to the new scientific method, they came to believe they could, in fact, control the laws of the universe. A second scientific innovation thrust them further from life and love's homeostatic equilibrium. Since the emergence of life on the unnamed planet, every being, excluding one, had utilized solar energy exclusively to fuel the work to care for elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin. Due to the unrestrained appetites of Euro-Americans, however, the surplus solar energy to feed domesticated fire had been thoroughly depleted. The life-giving forests throughout Europe had been decimated. Still unsatisfied and knowing no limits, Euro-Americans began to dig caverns in the denuded earth. There they found beneath the soil a third supply of energy. Coal fueled the fires to generate heat, as well as the power to move machines. There the digging did not stop. Soon a fourth supply of energy, a form of liquid coal called crude oil, was found even deeper underground. It was as if, buried beneath the soil, two new suns had suddenly been revealed. Once refined, oil would drive machines to do even more extraordinary things. In the primitive use of fire, Euro-Americans were unsurpassed. They may yet burn the fuel until the inhabited planet becomes desolate. Like an ironic catch-22, The first coal-fired machines burned coal to run pumps to extract water so the coal could be mined. Since more coal could be taken than was needed, the excess must obviously be burned. Anything less would be inefficient and unsustainable. Therefore, coal-fired machines were invented to manufacture by the millions what humans had once made by hand. Cheap and frequent consumption was streamlined. Matter and energy were converted into greater sums of money for fewer people to hoard. If money could not coerce the solar-powered poor to work for wealthy neighbors in repose, then coal, oil, and machines would perform the work instead. More heat, more output, less protest, less noise. Due to the increased consumption of energy from the fruit of the vine, the burning of the brush, and 2 new suns buried beneath the soil, as repositories of solar energy, the human population soared. Some Euro-Americans saw this as a raging success, a sure sign of their foreordained dominance. Others perceived the spike in population as an unequivocal threat. With heart-wrenching anguish, those pitiful, thirsty, starving black and brown bodies might coax Euro-Americans to share the resources their noble ancestors had successfully colonized, or, instead, bear first-hand witness to a species-level genocide. What were the beneficiaries of the inefficiency of inequality to do? For most, the conundrum seemed intractable. In response, they feigned ignorance or denial. "There is nothing to fear," they proclaimed. "Science and the free market will save us." By us, of course, they meant those they considered worth saving. Death and destruction were merely the latest market opportunities. Their abiding faith in gods old and new, the economy, science, or religion, was unwavering. They were like a child who plays pretend. If only they believed fervently enough, a voluntary change in behavior may yet be averted. Among the abundance of what was once freely given to be equally shared, and subsequently withheld from reach, the new phenomena called suffering spread. When a minority were permitted unfettered access to their needs and the privilege, power, and freedom to choose, while others were refused, Euro-Americans wrestled with the philosophical. Why did God allow such suffering to exist? Pain and sorrow from natural disasters and disease afflicted all beings with no regard for the inequality of wealth or status. Human suffering, by contrast, resulted from their relationships with work and money and how they mediated interactions with their neighbors. Money was both the lock and the key to determine access to medicine, housing, food, education, work, and safety. Malevolent power enlivened corrupt decisions, while fear, comfort, laziness, selfishness, or greed motivated the inaction. Most human suffering as a result was experienced in the regularity of daily life. Relief was readily available, but withheld for profitable ransoms, and only released to those willing and able to pay. For those so addicted to wealth and unwilling to experience life in less luxurious ways, they felt their needs had been met quite well. Why should they change? Deep wells of religious ink runneth over to try to resolve the riddle. How could God, both all-powerful and all-loving, merciful and just, allow such suffering as this? Intuiting the instructions emanating through the universe, something seemed amiss, like 2 left shoes, one size too small for the feet. A discreet error had been baked into the question. God did not allow suffering. Humans did. God has not been idle. our greatest great-grandparent, the source of the instructions for the universal ethic of care, has more than fulfilled their role. Doggedly, it, he, she, they, or we, depending on one's perspective, persists in attempts to gain the attention of narrow minds and hardened hearts. The evidence abounds. May those with eyes look around. With no laws, weapons, prisons, or private property, all beings, minus one, act with self-restraint. Elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin give to the best of their ability to care for each other and to consume only as they need. They live within the thresholds of homeostasis, of continuity and change, a shared equilibrium, of mutual reciprocity. Life and love waits with patience and hope for sapiens to listen, adjust, and adapt. Milder, modern synonyms for ancient phrases: take heed, turn back, repent. In the final minute, Euro-American Christianity became dubious. Some leaders, plagued by self-deception, seemed hypocritical. With the left hand they preached Christ's love, while the other secretly wielded the power to harm women, children, and neighbors. The institution and its participants seemed more or less satisfied with the status quo, far from loving, merciful, or just. As a result, many non-believers cast blame on a Christian God as powerful but apathetic, or its opposite, vengeful and cruel. For some, an impotent God must be a figment of weak imaginations. Alas, due to human hard-heartedness, many surrendered religious thought altogether. They jettisoned the universal ethic of care, meant to bind the web of life and love forever. More reliable directions were sought instead from science, atheism, philosophy, or New Age spirituality. Rather than God and religion, others, such as the well-dressed anarchists on the political right and their more disheveled brethren on the left, blamed the institution of government, or the nation-state, for our collective suffering. Many more blamed multinational corporations or academic elites. For some, the enemy was the 1%. To point a finger at the boogeyman was far easier than to say, it is I, it is us, we who are responsible. We must radically change, as individuals, families, and communities, in our places of work and our homes, if we are to survive and flourish together. Regardless of the evasions and distractions, the instructions embedded in that tiny mustard seed continue to pulse onward. They will carry on as long as life and love persists. Can you hear them? Listen closely. Even a whisper can echo throughout the infinite universe. So concludes chapter 5. Thank you for listening. I hope that you're enjoying the book.